Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Gaurav Gupta, Area Director of Biotechnology and Bioinformatics at the NIT University. And I would like to welcome you all to one of our flagship event, Learn from Master Series, where Professor P Balam, a Padma Bhushan awardee and a former director of Indian Institute of Science, will be delivering a talk titled Reflections on Chemistry and Biology in the age of the coronavirus. It is my strong belief that from today's lecture, participants of the webinar, which are a mix of students, educators, academicians, researchers, health professionals, and others, would gain significant insights about the virus that has led us into the pandemic. I also see this lecture by Professor P. Balaram to trigger significant interest in the mind of students of this university who would be interacting with Professor Balaram during the question and answer session. To talk more about this lecture, let me invite Mr. Vijay Thadani, the co-founder of NIT University. Over to you, Mr. Thadani.
Thank you, Gaurav. I would also like to offer my welcome bouquet to Professor Balaram, Professor Ashok Mishra, my colleague and founder of NIT University, Rajendra Singh Pawar, Professor Parimal Mandke, the new president, Dr. Day, Newtons, as we call our students, and nurturers, as we call our faculty, and esteemed guests. So just a word on the Learn from Masters series. Amongst some of the innovations that we have been trying at NIT University, Learn from Master series is one of them, which is a platform for offering a holistic understanding of a contemporary subject through interaction with experts in the field on one hand, peers from on the other, and lastly with industry captains and members of civic society. So in this coronavirus, we couldn't have chosen a more contemporary subject than coronavirus, which is contemporary and current, and humanity is at a heightened value of curiosity on the origins, treatment, and of late future of this. So in response, they have been confronted with extremely confusing and very often distorted information. So through the Learn from Masters series, we try to bring authentic points of view from various angles and various practitioners. Some time back, we had a medical practitioner of repute, Dr. Naresh Trehan, share his points of view. A few weeks ago, we had Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, a global policymaker, the chief scientist of World Health Organization, share her point of view. And today, to take us through the scientific origins of this coronavirus, we have another eminent scientist, Professor P. Balaram. He will tell us about the structure, the infection mechanisms, and the disease biology, amongst others. Most interesting for Newtons and nurturers is the fact that he will help us relate this back to the actual courses of biology and chemistry that we've been going through, and therefore relate them to some of the learning that which is happening in our labs and classrooms. Professor Balaram will be introduced by another eminent scientist and educationist, Professor Ashok Mishra. Professor, we are extremely fortunate to have him amongst us and as a member of our board of management of NIT University. He is a former director of IIT Bombay and currently the NASC Platinum Jubilee Chair, Distinguished Professor at Indian Institute of Science. After Professor Balaram's lecture, we will open up the session for question and answers, and we are looking for your active participation in that. I would now request Professor Mishra to introduce Professor Balaram, please.
Thank you, Vijay, and thank you Rajiv Pawar and NIT for giving me this opportunity to introduce my very dear friend, Professor P Balam, for the NIT University webinar under the Learn from Masters series. I have known Balram for, I don't know, over 2 decades at least, if not more. And we have interacted quite closely when he was the director of ISC Bangalore and I was at IIT Bombay. He was the director of the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore from 2005 to 2014. As the director of ISC, he introduced a number of innovative ideas for the transformation of the institute and in turn taking Indian Institute of Science to greater heights. He is a leading Indian biologist, nationally, of course, very well known and internationally very well known, and has been a faculty member in the molecular biophysics unit of ISC for most of his academic career. After his superannuation from the institute, he took up the position of distinguished professor at the National Center for Biological Sciences, the leading institute in India working in this area. Professor Balram is a very prolific researcher and has authored more than 400 outstanding research papers published in very good peer-reviewed journals and so on. His focus has been on the structure, conformation, and biological activity of designed and natural peptides. He is a fellow of all the 3 science academies in India, the Indian National Science Academy, the National Academy of Sciences India, and INSA, Indian National Science Academy. There are 3 science academies in India. And he is a fellow of several foreign academies, including TWAS, the World Academy of Sciences. He has received a large number of national and international awards in recognition of his outstanding achievements, the most prestigious being the Padma Bhushan by the Government of India, the TWAS Prize, and the R. Bruce Merrifield Award by the American Peptide Society. In addition, he has contributed immensely to the propagation of science in the country through the very prestigious journal called Current Science, and he was its editor for over a decade. In today's webinar, organized by NIT University, Professor Balram will share his research and views on the coronavirus, tracing the path to the pandemic, basically telling us about the origins and the history of the coronavirus. A very topical subject, which everybody wants to know, so much controversy, so much information, and we would really like to learn what Professor Balram has to say. So with this, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Balram to give his lecture.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mr. Thadani, Mr. Pawar, and Gaurav Gupta for inviting me to give this lecture. And of course, Professor Ashok Mishra, not only for getting me into this lecture, but also for his most generous introduction. I'm not going to tell you very much about the coronavirus, as you will see as I go along. But in preparing for this lecture, I was warned by Mr. Thadani that the audience would be general. And he at one point told me that would I like to break the talk so that one can have a little bit of something else in between. I said, no, I'd like to talk continuously. But what I've done is I'm going to digress every now and then in my talk, and I hope the digression will now provide the relief for you. What I'm going to talk about is chemistry and biology in the age of the coronavirus. I'm going to give you a very abridged history of the coronavirus. I'm going to talk a little bit about chemistry, a little biology, and then towards the very end, I'm going to have some reflections on science, engineering, and evolution. Now, most of you who will be listening are probably engineers or planning to become engineers. So I'll try to keep this as general as possible. This slide here, made on the 1st of July, a couple of days ago, tells you what the burden of the coronavirus pandemic currently is. This is from the Johns Hopkins dashboard. And you can see that we now have as many as 4 million people have died worldwide. This is the official death toll. In the United States alone, the death toll now has crossed 600,000. And India yesterday, the death toll crossed 400,000. So between the United States and India, about 1 million people have died. Another 500,000 people have died in Brazil. This is what makes up the 4 million dead in the world. So it's been an enormous crisis. And I don't think anybody who is alive today would have anticipated that such a crisis would overcome the world. But what I want you to look at here are the statistics here. You can see these phases, the daily cases, the daily deaths, the daily cases in red, the daily deaths in white. You can see how they're going up and down. So in India, for example, the second phase of the pandemic, which is the top panel under India, is almost over now. Now, the question, of course, is there going to be a third phase? And there will undoubtedly be a third phase because the virus is still with us. And you can see that this has happened worldwide. It's happened in the United States too. I want to tell you why we need to know something about the coronavirus. And since many of you might be undergraduate students, I thought I would attract your attention by playing you something. If we follow the advice in Godfather, then we must keep the coronavirus close. We must know everything that is to be known about the coronavirus if we're going to tackle it. Now, the coronavirus has captured everybody's imagination, for good or bad. In the early phase of the pandemic, when we went into our first major lockdown, the police were trying to enforce this. Everybody was dressed up like the coronavirus, policemen in Hyderabad, auto rickshaw drivers in Chennai, and so forth. It also turned out in Europe, which was badly affected, in Italy and France, around Easter time in 2020, they were actually making cakes and eggs in the form of the coronavirus. But things have moved very far. What I'm going to tell you in the first part of my presentation is how I spent time in the total lockdown. This was in the period towards the end of March 2020 and May of 2020. Another way of titling this would be to say, how did I, as a scientist sitting in Bangalore, that to a retired scientist, feature in a newsletter in Ure, Colorado? Ure, Colorado is a small town. It has 1,000 people. It has a historical society. And what I have on the slide is their newsletter. And there you can see that they have an article, a historic corona link to Ure. That historic corona link to Ure was really something that I discovered in the early phase of the pandemic. I was interviewed by an archivist in Arizona at that time, and I told the person who asked me, why were you doing this? And I'm going to tell you what I did. I said it is a tribute to the power of the internet that the road from Ure to Flagstaff in Arizona passes through Bangalore. It also seems to me that in some strange way, the virus has led us to its discoverer by turning the world upside down. What was I doing here? I was trying to find out who discovered the coronavirus in the first place. I'll give you a definition of a virus. The best definition that I found is in this philosophical dictionary of biology by the famous English immunologist Peter Medawar. It's called Aristotle to Zoos. He says, inasmuch as viruses are made known only by their causing disease or other pathological changes, the existence of benign viruses having no ill effects remains conjectural. No virus is known to do good. It has been well said that a virus is a piece of bad news wrapped up in protein. What is the bad news? The bad news is the nucleic acid, which is the genetic material which gives the virus its instructional program for replicating itself. And you have the protein coat all around it, and I'm going to describe this. And you also have a phospholipid bilayer. So the first thing to know about the coronavirus is it's an enveloped virus. It's an enveloped virus. It's spherical. It has all those wonderful projections on its surface, extremely symmetrical. I want you to look at the object. If you look at the coronavirus, and if you look at it as an engineer, you will find that it is a marvelous piece of architecture. This is biological architecture. A spherical virus with symmetrically dispersed spikes on its surface. We're going to come back to that spike. But long, long ago, about 100 years or more ago, one of the founding fathers of modern medicine, and probably one of its most articulate practitioners, William Osler, wrote that soap and water and common sense are the best disinfectant. You will all remember that ever since this pandemic started, we've been advised to wash our hands frequently. And what does that soap and water do? It dissolves the phospholipid bilayer and disintegrates the virus. There is a lipid membrane, which is like a detergent kind of membrane, and therefore applying detergent now disintegrates it, and then the virus is no longer functional. Now let's go back in time. 1967, this paper appeared. This is what I read last April. The morphology of 3 previously uncharacterized human respiratory viruses that grow in organ culture. So you have organ culture in the laboratory, and you're trying to grow viruses in them. And look at the picture in the middle. That's the first electron micrograph of the coronavirus. When the pandemic started, June Almeida, who's pictured here, a picture appeared in many of our newspapers. It appeared saying that she was the discoverer of the coronavirus. But I want to read only one sentence here, the sentence in red. Probably the most interesting finding from these experiments was that 2 human respiratory viruses, 229E and B814, are morphologically identical with avian infectious bronchitis virus. Those numbers and letters characterize a sample. And I was interested in 229E because when I read a scientific paper, I like to read the experimental and I like to read the acknowledged ones. So there you will find that if you read the paper carefully, the figure shows the electron micrograph and says this type of particle was seen, and this was with strain 229E. And then down in the acknowledgement, it says that they thank Dr. D. Hambre for the 229E virus. So my next question was, I was already planning to give lectures, I suppose, subconsciously. My next question was, who was Dr. D. Hambre? I went back to the literature and I found this paper. This was in 1966, 1 year before the other paper, and strain 229E is the first coronavirus demonstrated as a human pathogen. And I realized that she was a lady because her name was Dorothy. So it was Dorothy Henry, and I was now looking for a lady. And she said that the nucleic acid of these viruses is RNA, and the size of the virus is 89 millimicrons. Today, we would say it's 89 nanometers. Scale is very important. Everybody's interested in nanotechnology. If you're interested in nanotechnology, the virus is a marvelous piece of nanobiology. In 1967, the next year, in the same paper which I showed you, along with the micrograph, they estimated the size. It was 80 to 100 nanometers. So her estimate was spot on. And in 1968, the word coronavirus entered the scientific literature for the first time because a group of virologists got together and said that a new group of viruses has been recognized, and this is the group. I looked carefully through that list, and there was her name, P. Henry. I said, wonderful, she's also one of the discoverers of the coronavirus. Then I went to Google, which is what all of us do nowadays, especially in the pandemic. We are perpetually on the internet. I found lots of papers when I put her name in. So she was a scientist. Checked further and found she'd published many papers in the years between 1943 and 1972. I went under Google Images and I found many pictures of Dorothy Henry. None of them matched because they were too young. They didn't look like scientists. And when I researched them a little bit further, I found that they were socialites usually. So here was a productive scientist who actually discovered the coronavirus, but there was no picture of her anywhere. So I then began to search for who was Dorothy Henry. By this time, I had some clues, and I found that there was a reference to her in an archives at the University of Northern Arizona. So I wrote an email on the 29th of April last year to the archivist, to the curator there, and asked them, would you have a photograph? I have found her married name, Brownlee, and therefore she must be listed there. And your archives does lead me to that name. And so could you please look? I got into this most marvelous correspondence then for the next month or so. Every day emails going back and forth. And Arizona was in the midst of the pandemic. The people could not get to the archives, but they found this request so interesting. They did one day break whatever restrictions were there, entered the archives, found photographs, and eventually gave them to me. And so I then discovered what she looked like. And by this time, I'd found out she was born in 1915. She died in 1989. And she was a research associate until the very end at the University of Chicago. She was an important virologist, never got a job. She was a young woman at the time of the Second World War. She worked during the Depression, and she was a very successful scientist. Nevertheless, never got a faculty position, which is something which tells you about what gender equality meant during the years of the Depression and the years immediately after the Second World War. But the man who really brought the coronavirus to the scientific literature was David Tyrell. He was an important English scientist. He was doing research. What was he doing? He was trying to do research on the common cold, and he was trying to find a vaccine for the cold. Because after the war, the British found that the maximum number of days in every workshop and every factory was lost by people suffering from colds. So they wanted a vaccine. He worked on the coronavirus. He worked on the rhinovirus, which causes cold. Coronavirus also causes cold. And no vaccine could ever be found because of the diversity of the viruses. The way he did this research, including the finding of the coronavirus, is very interesting. What you would do is you would take nasal secretions and then analyze them. Try to grow the virus in the culture, or even better, try to infect someone who did not have a cold. You give them the nasal secretions from someone else who has a cold, and then see, do they get the cold or not? And try to get more virus. This was called the Common Cold Unit, and this is how they attracted volunteers. This is historical now because you can see 10 days holidays free. So if you were young and you wanted a holiday, you would go there, get yourself infected with cold, you would get paid for it, and you would now work at this. Later on, this entire facility was closed down. The bottom left, you might see all those barracks. And those of you who are old will remember that those are the kind of barracks which were used to house servicemen during the Second World War. These were all converted after the war into virology research on the common cold, and the coronavirus came out of these researches. But David Perrell was an important scientist, and in 1996, he wrote this final summary on the coronavirus. He said the coronavirus causes acute, mild upper respiratory infection, common cold. Therefore, since it causes only mild infection, this 1986 article suggested that maybe there wouldn't be too much interest in the coronavirus in the future. You must remember about 30% of the colds that we've been getting all these years are probably caused by coronaviruses. And no one in India had ever looked at the coronavirus before the pandemic. Now, one question which might occur to those of you who are not biologists, are viruses living things? Now, it turns out that viruses are at the borderline of chemistry and biology. They inhabit what I would call a shadowy no man's land between chemistry and biology. One moment, they are simply a collection of complex chemicals symmetrically arranged. But once they infect you, they have this ability to multiply. But in order to multiply, they need to use the machinery of your cells. They need human cells in order to multiply. So you will find in the literature 10 reasons to exclude viruses from the tree of life. Then other people asking the question, do viruses exchange genes across the various kingdoms of life? There are 3 major kingdoms in life: eukarya, bacteria, and archaea. We all belong to eukarya. We are all part of the eukaryotic kingdom, which includes animals, plants, and so on. But in 2003, something happened. In 2003, the World Health Organization received a phone call from the Vietnam French hospital in Hanoi. And on the 28th of February, they asked the World Health Organization to help them because they had found a patient who appeared to be suffering from a new form of pneumonia. Already there were rumors that in Guangdong province in southern China, there were already cases of a new type of influenza which had been spreading. WHO reacted immediately and dispatched to the Hanoi hospital a remarkable man, Carlo Urbani, an Italian, but a man who also worked with the Médecins Sans Frontières. And Urbani went there and immediately recognized that this was a new infectious disease. He ordered quarantine. He immediately outfitted everybody with protective equipment, and extraordinary quarantine was imposed by Vietnam. March 9th, 2003, this happened. So you can see how quickly it's happened. In 10 days, this is what has happened. This is 2003, in the 21st century. Urbani went to Bangkok, but en route to Bangkok on the 11th of March, he realized he had symptoms. So when he landed at Bangkok airport, he asked the other people who had come to receive him not to come anywhere near him. And he was already outfitted with a PPE, which we are all familiar with today. He was hospitalized, quarantined, and died on the 29th of March. This was a remarkably virulent virus. This is what is today called SARS-1 or SARS-CoV-1. What we are struggling with today is what is called SARS-2 or SARS-CoV-2. On the left-hand side of the slide is a new paper in Nature Reviews in Microbiology, 2019, where the Chinese scientist who's very much in the news now, Zhengli Shi, summarized how bat viruses can be transmitted to human beings through intermediary animals. But many of the earlier human viruses, which were characterized by Dorothy Henry and David Tyrrell, there is no known mode of transmission. They were first detected. The first coronavirus was detected in medical undergraduate students at the University of Chicago, and that is the coronavirus 229E. I'm going to digress a little bit into chemistry before coming back to biology. What is chemistry? The best description of chemistry has come from Arthur Kornberg. Since my host is from the Department of Biotechnology, I must say, Kornberg, as the discoverer of the enzyme DNA polymerase, probably fired the first shot in the biotechnology revolution. Kornberg, in his later years, called chemistry the lingua franca of the medical and biological sciences. He even argued that chemistry and biology must work very closely. Sometimes they don't work very closely because chemists appear to be using their left brain, while biologists appear to be using their right brain. And of course, engineers must always only use their left brain because that is the part which deals with analytic thought, science, and mathematics. So too physicists. But why is chemistry important? Chemistry deals with atoms and molecules. And so if you go back and look at Feynman's first lecture in his famous lecture series at Caltech, you will find this. He asks the question, if in some cataclysm, all of scientific knowledge were to be destroyed, and only one sentence passed on to the next generation of creatures, what statement would contain the most information in the fewest words? He says, I believe it is the atomic hypothesis or the atomic fact or whatever you wish to call it, that all things are made up of atoms, little particles that move around in perpetual motion, attracting each other when they're a little distance apart and repelling one another upon being squeezed into one another. This tells you everything that you needed to know about atoms and molecules, how atoms get together, what happens when you squeeze them, and so on. Chemistry and biology deal with molecules. They deal with complex aggregates of molecules in biology, and so we must worry about length and time scales. Engineers worry a lot about length scales. They worry a lot about energy scales and so on. But look at length and time scales. Goes over several orders of magnitude, 16 orders of magnitude sometimes, or more. So you have simple molecules at one end, and then you have an entire red blood cell at the other. Viruses fall somewhere in between, and you can see where the spherical virus really is placed. Is there any relationship between chemistry and biotechnology? I found this interesting cartoon on the internet. There's this man working on a crossword puzzle, and he asks his wife, what's a 9-letter word for biotechnology? She immediately answers chemistry. I might ask another question. What is a 9-letter word for material science? The answer, of course, will again be chemistry. So there is nothing in the world which is not chemical. You are full of chemicals. You're made of chemicals. Everything is around you is chemical. So when Patanjali promises you something that is chemical free, or there's a salt which is sold which is chemical free, you know that they're talking nonsense. Why is chemistry not a subject which is liked by students? The reason for it is that you need to learn the alphabets of chemistry, which are chemical structures. So you need to learn a language before you can actually understand the subject very well. Just as in mathematics, symbols and equations are the alphabet of mathematics. If you go to a school and ask students which subject you like, for physics and biology, many students will put up their hands. But for chemistry and mathematics, the numbers will be very much smaller. The reason for it is the linguistic barrier to learning these two subjects and the familiarity with the language in which the discourse of these disciplines takes place. But politicians understand chemistry instinctively. Here, for example, I have many slides like this, but I'm showing you only one, because if I show you the Prime Minister, then that takes care of everything. Immediately after the election results of 2019, Mr. Modi declared that chemistry defeated arithmetic in 2019. What do you mean? Chemistry is what links people, ideas, that we call chemistry. Arithmetic is, of course, how many seats do you have in the parliament or in the legislative assemblies? How many seats can you get by defection? So these are the two subjects which politicians understand instinctively, chemistry and arithmetic. They will also understand the meaning of genetic material. They use the word DNA very commonly. The Congress party will say that communalism is in the DNA of the BJP. The BJP will say dynastic politics is in the DNA of the Congress. So DNA is again a scientific term, which is well understood by politicians. So there is no reason for the general public not to understand them. What are the foundational pillars of chemistry? These are the foundational pillars. I'm not going to discuss them. Mendeleev's periodic table, which gives us all the elements. Wooler's synthesis of urea from ammonium cyanide, which tells us that inanimate chemicals can be converted into chemicals which are found in biology. The barrier between chemistry and biochemistry is broken. Boltzmann's work on heat. Engineers, mechanical engineers, and others use heat all the time. Boltzmann's work on heat is fundamental. Statistical mechanics owes everything to Boltzmann. What was he studying? He was studying heat, which is the perpetual motion of atoms. Came upon the idea of entropy. And on his gravestone, you will find the famous law, S is equal to KLNW, inscribed on his gravestone. Boltzmann gave us the idea of the atom, the first physicist to think of atoms. Chemists thought of atoms, but he was the first physicist to think of atoms. And then, of course, Pasteur gave us the ideas linking chemistry and biochemistry, stereochemistry, three-dimensionality in chemistry, the founding father of microbiology. Where do all these elements come from? Engineers are using elements everywhere. Today, electrical technology, nanotechnology, nanoscience uses the most exotic elements. I draw your attention to a book which, if you're a student, you must read. It's Bronowski's The Ascent of Man. I'll come back to this at the very end. This is based on a BBC series of the early 1970s, where Bronowski traces the ascent of man from the beginning, from 30,000 years ago, all the way to the present. But in one point, he talks about atoms. And he says, in all the stars that are going on processes, which build up the atoms one by one into more complex structures, matter itself evolves. And he says the word comes from Darwin and biology, but it is the word that changed physics in my lifetime. You must remember this. The word evolution is very important. It is something that one must understand. He goes on, he's poetic when he asks, where is carbon formed? He says it's formed in a star when three helium nuclei collide at one spot within less than 1/1,000,000 of a millionth of a second, 10 to the minus 12 of a second. Every carbon atom in every living creature has been formed by such a wildly improbable collision, which means life itself is improbable. Life on Earth is improbable. So when we ask the question, is there life somewhere else in outer space? We ask a grand question. Is chemistry favorable for biology? I will return to the virus. Now, if you look, but we've come to 2006, electron cryomicroscopy is beginning to develop. You can get more detailed pictures of what the coronavirus looks like. This is the first coronavirus, what we today can call the Urbani virus. This one, dimensions match what was there in the early literature, amazingly. And it tells us in detail what the sizes of all the molecules which are there, proteins, nucleic acid, phospholipid, which go together to make the structure. There are more and more detailed structures of the virus particle emerging. We know what the virus must do. But I draw your attention only to one feature. On the top left, if you look, you will find the spiky projection. That's what gave the virus its name. That's the corona. But that spike is a protein molecule. The protein molecule called the spike protein. That molecule is needed for coronavirus to bind to the receptor cells in your body, especially in the lung. It binds to another molecule. It is this fusion of the virus and the cell which eventually allows the genetic material to get into the cell. So that protein is very important. Today, if you go and take a vaccine, what does the vaccine do? The vaccine hopefully produces other protein molecules, antibodies. It will now coat this and prevent it from interacting with its receptor. It will intercept the virus before it gets to its host. If it doesn't do it very well, the vaccine will not be effective. So if you say a vaccine is 60% efficacious, 80% efficacious, 90% efficacious, it means one thing, it's not 100% efficacious. Why are proteins important? Long ago, the high priest of molecular biology, Francis Crick, a physicist, shortly after he had discovered the structure of DNA along with Jim Watson, wrote this in 1958. He said the main function of proteins is to act as enzymes. And then at the end, he concluded, there seems little point in genes doing anything else but protein synthesis. So genes, which is DNA or RNA in the case of the virus, hold the information. But what this information does is allow you to make proteins. Those proteins then assemble. They self-assemble really to give you the viral particle. But the process of viral membrane fusion, and this is technical, I will not dwell on this in detail, has been understood with respect to the influenza virus. All these viruses have those spiky projections. Those spiky projections must now undergo large amount of molecular deformations before the process of fusion happens. Remarkable work which has been done by X-ray diffraction and more recently by cryo-electron microscopy. The structural biology has provided very detailed atomic insights into some of these processes, although all details are not yet understood. It is only when you understand all these details can you actually now try to interfere with the process itself in a rational way. To show you how far things have gone in 2020 and 2021, many papers appear which give you the atomic structure of that spike. You can see it looks like a spike. All the atoms in that spike can now be visualized, or if not all the atoms, a majority of atoms on that spike. Feynman would have been pleased that the atomic hypothesis is now really finding place in biology on this grand scale. Structural biologists have different ways of visualizing these structures. Professor Ashok Mishra likes polymers. And if you look at polymers, a protein is a polymer. It's a biological polymer. And so what you see in this color is just a trace of the backbone of the polymeric protein, winding around in three-dimensional space with all the structures which are shown there. Spring-like structures, stretched out structures, unstructured regions. This now is a machine. It's a machine which does its job. And biology is full of machines. They are what one would call nano machines in operation. They're made of soft matter. And that's what differentiates them from the constructs of engineering. The last year has been spectacular for this field. Many, many papers appear, much more than what you can actually imagine, by scientists in America, in China, and Europe. And these structures, complex to cellular receptors, everything has now been determined. But I won't spend too much time on it, except to tell you, why is all this being done? Because it's this kind of work which can eventually lead to rational, therapeutic, and vaccine design. But the pandemic is not going to wait. Therefore, we need vaccines anyway without, in an empirical way, and that's gone on very well and very far. But let's get back to the pandemic. I've just blown up my first slide again. This shows you India. We had a lull between January 1st and March 20th. This was the period in which India declared victory from the over the coronavirus. And this was the time also when the Prime Minister spoke at the G7 summit and said that India has conquered the coronavirus. One should never claim victory until the enemy has truly disappeared from the scene. The virus was just lying in lurk because many, many people are asymptomatic and therefore they're quite healthy, but the virus still multiplies in them and then it spreads again. And then the susceptible people get it. Look at the difference in the peaks. The first peak was broad. It was determined by lockdown. The second peak is very sharp, very intense, and it was a dreadful peak. I would therefore digress into biology now. But I might ask a general question. Whether you're a physicist or a biologist or a chemist or a mathematician even, what do you study, or a geologist, to try to understand nature? And what is nature? There's no better definition of nature than this one by the German poet von Goethe. What Goethe said was this: nature is surrounded and embraced by her, powerless to separate ourselves from her, and powerless to penetrate beyond. The translation of Goethe's essay, written around 1780, appeared in the first issue of the most important journal in science today, which is called Nature, in the year 1869, on November 4th, 1869. And Thomas Huxley, the famous biologist, was asked to write this editorial. He didn't write the editorial. He translated from the German Goethe's essay of 1780. This is a marvelous essay which will tell everybody, what do you mean by nature? But a word from Darwin on natural selection, adaptation, and evolution. It's important in trying to understand the violence. Darwin says here, there's grandeur in this view of life, with several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. This is really the crux of biology. In the 5.6 billion years of evolution on Earth, the first 1.5 billion years or so had no life form at all. The Earth was only chemical. It was only after that that biology began to evolve. And the word evolution means something different in biology from what it really means in common day English. But I'll return to Bronowski here again. What Bronowski says here, that among the multitude of animals which scamper, fly, burrow, and swim around us, man is the only one who is not locked into his environment. His imagination, his reason, his emotional subtlety and toughness make it possible for him not to accept the environment, but to change it. And that series of inventions by which man from age to age has remade his environment is a different kind of evolution, not biological, but cultural. I call that brilliant sequence of cultural peaks the ascent of man. What Bronowski calls a cultural peak, each peak is reached by a scientific advance, by a technological advance. The Industrial Revolution is one such which gave us engineering. Similarly, everything from the invention of agriculture, the invention of tools, everything has been an advance in science and technology. So cultural evolution really means something else. There are three pillars of modern biology, foundational pillars. Two of them were erected in the 19th century, genetics and evolution. Genetics by Gregor Mendel and evolution by Darwin. Everyone knows genetics instinctively. Children have the same similar characteristics to their parents. Grandparents look at grandchildren and hope that they have some of their characteristics. Evolution depends upon variation and selection. But how does this variation happen? It happens by mutation. Where does it happen? It happens in DNA. So you need chemistry. DNA is a molecule, and mutations must happen in DNA. And therefore, chemistry is needed. The chemistry of heredity was really the foundation was laid by Oswald Avery, who discovered DNA as the genetic material in 1944. And Watson and Crick gave us the double helical structure of DNA, which tells us how information can be transferred in biology. Information in biology can be transferred, but often not perfectly, sometimes with slight variation. It's that variation which Darwinian natural selection then operates upon. But since you are an audience of engineers, I might just remind you that the dominant technologies of our times have their roots in fundamental science. In my own state of Karnataka, information technology and biotechnology are the two most popular disciplines. We have even a minister for what we call IT-BT. And one must be very careful once even politicians like some kind of term. Where did these come from? These came from work in the mid-1940s. Claude Shannon's famous work on the mathematical theories, first paper in science on information theory, is a starting point for information technology. Avery's paper on DNA as a genetic material is a starting point for biotechnology. Manipulation of DNA is what has really led to biotechnology. Today, we know a great deal about DNA sequences. We can determine genome sequences of organisms. And over the years, what has happened is, what we realize here is the unity of biology. Human beings and chimpanzees are on the same branch of the genetic tree. So are rats and mice. So are pigs, cattle, sheep, horses, and dogs. And they're not all too far from one another. What this tells us is that when we fight, and when we fight about pigs and cattle and monkeys and human beings fight with one another, what we fail to recognize is the unity of biology and the existence of human beings as a species. The coronavirus is the first time in recent memory that human beings have been challenged as a species. What is culture? Will culture also evolve? Scientists worry about this. Sociologists worry about this. Cultural transmission is more complex than genetic transmission, may occur on short time scales, even within a single generation. It is this kind of cultural transmission that people who lead religions, people who lead countries want to achieve, who are ideologically committed. They would like to transform. But we might ask a different question. Can cultural transformations exert pressures on genetic traits? Can we evolve biologically because of a cultural shift? For much of human history, there was no reason to digest milk after you were weaned from your mother. No animal, no mammal keeps on drinking milk. But human beings do not have the ability originally to digest the sugar lactose which is found in milk. It's only when you're a baby you have it. Within a few months, the lactase gene is shut off, a developmental program. And then you can't break lactose into glucose and galactose. You can't digest it anymore. If lactase persists, that is, the gene is not turned off, that portion of the population can keep drinking milk. And over the years, after the invention of dairy farming may have been the first engineering revolution. After the invention of dairy farming, people began to use dairy products. Those who had severe diarrhea, in those days oral rehydration was not known, this would have been 10, 20,000 years ago, they died. Those who survived were those who were having the enzyme lactase persisting in adulthood. Over thousands of years, they have mated with other people who have lactase persistence, and lactase persistent populations have spread over the world. Today, you can analyze this. Those circles that you see on the global map, the red part of it is where you can digest milk. You have lactase gene. The places where the red has thinned down, you don't have the lactase gene. So today, if one is thinking of a nutritional intervention in Southern Africa, it would be the wrong thing to push European dairy products by the UNESCO and other organizations into Southern Africa. So science tells you this. Look at this. The Far East, again, very little. South of India and north of India are distinct difference. More people in South are lactose intolerant, but we've learned to live with indigestion. That's a cultural trait now. We accept a certain amount of discomfort because it is important to drink milk. So I've told you a little bit about biology, a little bit about chemistry. I can't resist concluding my lecture, but I have to tell you a little bit about history. You must look at this book. This is by the Israeli historian Yuval Harari on Sapiens, the brief history of humankind. Harari is a historian, but I found his understanding of biology sometimes far better than the understanding of many expert biologists. He now, towards the end of his book, he asked this question: what do we mean by history and what do we mean by biology? 30,000 years ago, where were your ancestors and mine? They were hunter-gatherers. They hunted for their food and they ate it. That was their only imperative. They reproduced. They were just like the other animals. Small groups, hunting and gathering. They are still there in some places in the world, some notably in one or two of the Andaman Islands. He says the immense diversity of imagined realities that sapiens invented and the resultant diversity of behavior patterns are a main component of what we call culture. And he says, once cultures appeared, they never cease to change and develop. These unstoppable alterations of what we call history. So you ask the question, when did history diverge from biology? 30,000 years ago, any history was biological history. The cognitive revolution is accordingly the point when history declared its independence from biology. What is the cognitive revolution? The cognitive revolution began with the invention of agriculture, which means about 30,000 years ago, human societies began to become stationary because they could now produce food. If they produced food in a limited plot of land, what do they have to do? They have to protect it. In order to protect your land, what do you have to do? You have to make a larger group, and you then form societies. How do you keep a society together? You keep a society together only by feeding society with myths, ideas, images, and fantasies. So if you look at the development, for example, of modern religion, it will coincide with every technological advance that we have made. Lastly, science and engineering. I realized when I was talking to Mr. Tadani that he was maybe mildly uncomfortable, and I might say something that may not be appreciated entirely by engineers. But I was for almost a decade the director of an institution which had 50% scientists and 50% engineers, something that the IITs for a very long time never ever had. Therefore, I had to have a very fine dividing line in keeping scientists and engineers both equally happy. And I used to read a lot then. And I found these wonderful definitions. Henry Petrosky said, often considered distinct, engineering and science are frequently difficult to distinguish. Today, at the frontiers of research, engineers, scientists, and doctors, they all work together. Von Karman said that the scientist seeks to understand what is. That is nature. The engineer seeks to create what never was. But this definition is no longer true. With the birth of biotechnology, we have begun to create organisms. We have the capability to create organisms. We can create transgenic plants, for instance. That is the big political discussion on biotechnology as applied to agriculture. We can create new protein molecules as therapeutic vaccines. So in this last slide, I have to ask the question, where did the coronavirus come from? Is it the product of natural Darwinian evolution? Nature has given us the virus through years and years of experimentation, variation, and selection. Or was it a laboratory creation? Is it a genetically engineered virus? But one thing in the year, the pandemic, I have stared and stared and stared at the spherical coronavirus. What has really stuck with me is its beautiful symmetry. There's a symmetry about it that is really engaging in these pictures. I can only turn to a poem in English, which I read a very long time ago, and I remembered this, called The Tiger. That's the correct spelling. That's how William Blake spelled it. What Blake asked was this: what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? And then towards the end of the poem, he's asked the question, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? So obviously Blake was a religious man. Evolution was still in the future. Darwin probably was not born at the time he wrote this poem. And so he asked this question, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? So on the one hand, nature has many beautiful creatures. At other times, nature also has some creatures which appear to us fearful. But the tiger, whom we visibly see and we try to protect today, is not fearful at all. Left in its own habitat, the tiger will do very well. We are a greater danger to the tiger than the tiger is to us. But one cannot say the same thing about the virus. The virus is an unseen enemy. And an unseen enemy, one must be extraordinarily careful with it. I will end with two quotations, both from a favorite author of mine, John Le Carre. In the years when I was young, if you wanted to read spy stories, you read James Bond. And James Bond, of course, was always with beautiful girls. James Bond was always killing other people and jumping off all kinds of fast-moving objects. But in reality, spying is not like that. That was first came to the general public in a book written by John Le Carre called The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. This was during the Cold War. In one of his later books, Le Carre says, survival is an infinite capacity for suspicion. And in another place, he says in The Honorable Schoolboy, a desk is a dangerous place from which to watch the world. And over the last year and a half, what I've really done is to watch the world more or less sitting at my desk. So in concluding this talk, I have only one acknowledgement, and that is the acknowledgement to the two institutions which have provided me a shelter, and wonderful shelter, for my entire professional and post-retirement career so far. The Indian Institute of Science at the top left, where I spent over 42 years, and the National Center for Biological Sciences at the bottom right, which has given me a post-retirement home. Both these institutions have provided me an opportunity to read whatever I like, to write whatever I like, to do whatever research I want to do, and also to talk about anything that I want to talk about. So it is that kind of freedom which I believe that academic institutions must have in order for there to be a full exchange of ideas between different disciplines. Thank you very much for inviting me and for the patience with which you've heard.
Thank you, Professor Balaraman. This is an absolutely fascinating journey that you took us through. And I don't think they teach us all that at the IIT or before that at the school that we went to. But a very, very lucid description, even for an electrical engineer who I don't think ever strayed into biology, ever, even by mistake. So really, my compliments on this. And I'm sure there are many amongst us who understood this much better. So I would like to open this for questions. And I do know that there is one person who's dying to ask a question, and that is Rajendra Singh Pawar. So may I just ask Raji Pawar to ask his question.
Thank you, Vijay, and thank you, Professor Balram, for a brilliant journey that you took us on. I was somehow hoping you'd take us one step ahead to look at biology, science, and geopolitics, but you stayed a step short of it. But my question basically comes from saying that man, the creator, let me say now, who evolves and uses knowledge to go from one stage to the other and does many creations. And I'm using the word creation because you talked about the creation of the coronavirus. And I'm trying to get to a basic question, which is going beyond the science, but raising the fundamental question that when we create something as people, as organizations, as individuals, we have an obligation and a responsibility for the effects of that creation. That may go into culture, it may go into other subjects beyond that. But when we look at nature and we look at, you give the example of the lamb and the tiger, and there's nature at work. And you said that man, the one who distanced himself from it and then perhaps started doing the good and the bad things. So does accountability of man to all the things we do come from this separation from nature essentially? Because we don't hold the animal responsible for degradation. So that's the first question. And maybe there's one more that follows.
Yeah, I would think much of what one would call contemporary problems are really because of human activity. It is not really a consequence of biology, but of the consequence of human activity which impacts nature. Whether it is climate change, uh, climate change is an indirect effect of human activity, but that human activity also degrades the environment in a major way. And therefore, that's a part of the overall Earth cycle. And so we have impacted it in a major way. So I think we are accountable, but I don't know accountable to whom. We are actually accountable only to ourselves, really.
So fine, there's a farmer in Punjab who has to burn the crop because he has no other way and he causes fire and that causes pollution in Delhi, is one kind of accountability where you can claim helplessness. But when the bomb was created, for example, and deliberately used in Hiroshima, that is another kind of accountability. And one can say, okay, it was devastating, but it dealt with a little zone and a little space. But if the coronavirus is a creation of man, and this use or mistake or whatever happened has had far greater consequences, then, do we have to think of accountability and responsibility? And therefore, the whole approach of using science, the whole question of saying that we do science for the good of man, but everything is a double-edged, so dual use of technology. But if a mistake or an error, if this was an error or if it was deliberate, we don't know, I don't know. But even if it's a mistake, as scientists, when we have to think of containing the work that our scientists do or managing it or putting an envelope around it, do we worry about this issue of accountability and then responsibility if the experiments go so much out of control that they challenge existence itself?
No, I see here when you bring the nuclear issue, uh, uh, the bomb itself was really because of the war. And it was the imperative of the Second World War which led to the atom bomb. Much of the virus research which has gone on, some of it has also been because of the biological weapons kind of activity which people have been doing. It's gone on in the United States, it's gone on in Europe, it's gone on in China, many places because of that. But in the case of the virus, the gain of function research, which you will see in the next month or so, because articles have now begun appearing, a major expose has come just a couple of days ago. The gain of function research is even more, it's very controversial. It need not be done because of this danger of a laboratory leak. What it promised to do was that it promised to help you protect against future pandemics. But future pandemic may come, nature may do this, a better virus only after another 1,000 years. So I don't think one might, there's a justification for doing this gain of function research which has been done. I think this is going to be looked at. This is what you mean by accountability. I have a feeling that would be shut down. But what is interesting is last April, when this discussions had begun, March, April, President Trump was asked at a press conference that some work in the Chinese laboratory has been funded by the US government. And this was this gain of function research. And he didn't know about it. So he immediately said, how can it be funded? I'll put a stop to it. And immediately stopped it. Now, after he stopped it, there is this letter which is written by 81 Nobel laureates, which says that you can't stop scientific collaboration like this, and this is not the way to stop scientific research. And the United States refunded the grant in July of 2020. So now I would say that we must be very, very careful in what we do. I must confess that I am very afraid of the word accountability. I've never understood who is accountable for anything. Generally, for nothing for which you feel people should be accountable is anybody accountable. So this is a much more, I would say, abstract kind of accountability.
Gaurav, before we get into student, Professor Mishra has a question. So since we have lots of questions, I would just request everyone to keep the questions short so that Professor Balaram also gets his chance to say the most specific thing that he would like to share. But go ahead, Ashok.
I have two different questions. One is, I wonder if I'm sure you have read the book On the Future by Martin Rees. And he predicted the pandemic in 2020 several years back, and he actually bet $200 with some scientist, some journalist, science journalist person, that he says, I would love to lose this bet, but I won't lose this bet. How can an astronomer 12, 14 years back predict this pandemic, which is totally a biological phenomenon? And I have one more question after that, which will be shorter than this.
Well, I will say many times people can be right for the wrong reasons. You see, for example, I tell you, as far as the lab leak hypothesis now is concerned, Donald Trump was right, but he had no reason to be right. So I would put both Martin Rees and Donald Trump as being right for the wrong reasons. But since he was an astrophysicist, I would say there is a connection between astrophysics and viruses. The famous astrophysicist Fred Hoyle had this theory that sunspots and pandemics correlate. So he'd gone back and then viruses are now coming with the stream of particles carried through space. So he put viruses now as extraterrestrial. And Hoyle's theory of panspermia, as it's called, is what actually denied him the Nobel Prize. Because the other two people who did all the fantastic work with him got the Nobel Prize, but they left him out. But Hoyle had this theory that at the beginning of this pandemic, an astrophysicist at the Indian Institute of Astrophysics sent me Hoyle's original articles and asked me what I thought about them. And now, of course, there's a correlation that is found. But, you know, many times correlations are not causations. Two completely independent parameters could be correlated statistically. And see, the problem is like this. If Martin Rees had been wrong, we wouldn't have given it a second thought.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. That's fascinating. Well, the other one is a shorter question. There were some articles in the newspapers by two scientists from Pune who have traced several articles written by people from China on the virus. So can you throw some light on that?
Yes, this is very interesting. There's stuff which is now available in a magazine called Vanity Fair, an extraordinarily researched article which has just appeared. I'll send it to you. The two people are from the Agarkar Research Institute. Names are Sonali Rahalkar and her husband Rahul Bahulikar. I have been in touch with them. They actually worked with a group called Drastic. Drastic is an internet group which was set up in the early days of the pandemic by some Western scientists. There is actually an anonymous Indian also contributing. He's a science teacher somewhere in Bengal or in Eastern India. And he only goes by the name Seeker. And what the Seeker did was to find a Chinese master's thesis, which detailed pneumonias following ice of miners entering a cave in a province in southern China. And the Wuhan virologists who work very far away had actually gone to this cave and collected these things. This was in 2012. And it's now not clear what they found. And so there is a lot of, but this group, the Chinese thesis was Google translated by this young man who calls himself the Seeker. And then this little article was written up by these two people in Pune and appeared in an obscure journal. And but now there is a connection between what the Chinese found in 2012 and what's happened in 2019.
Okay, thanks. Gaurav, you said students have some questions. So
yes. So we have one of the students who's a graduating fourth year student, Lasya Priya. So Lasya, you might want to ask a question to Professor Balaram.
Good evening, sir. My name is Lasya, and I'm a final year BTech student doing biotechnology at NIT University. And my question is, since the emergence of the first COVID, since the emergence of the first COVID case, there have been reports of multiple strains of the virus. So I wanted to ask, how does evolutionary genetics impact our understanding of the strains of the virus, of the SARS-CoV strains?
Yes, in fact, I have to say that even this is some analysis that I'm also doing with a large database of sequences which is now available. But let's assume that a virus comes either from nature or from, that is zoonotic transfer from an animal or a laboratory creation which has leaked out, doesn't matter, whichever. Once it gets into a human being, it will mutate because it undergoes many passages through human cells and goes from person to person. And viruses don't replicate perfectly, and therefore mutations will be there at every step. Now, as these mutations accumulate, Darwinian natural selection operates. Those viruses which don't work better will simply die, but those which are multiplying faster will soon take over. So even now, there's a very interesting mutation. It's at one specific amino acid in the spike protein, 614, where there is an aspartic acid to glycine mutation. The World Health Organization will call it D614G. That means one letter changed to another. But this is now found in the overwhelming percentage of samples from all over the world. So very early on in the pandemic, that mutation happened. There's another interesting mutation which has happened all over the world, but primarily in India now, and which I believe is responsible for the second phase. That is a mutation of a proline to an arginine, just at the furin cleavage site. And you will now find that, so mutations will happen. But since you're all, even if you're doing biology, you say you're doing technology. Now, there's a great difference between a BTech in biotechnology and a BTech in mechanical engineering. The BTech in mechanical engineering tomorrow makes a car. The car is not going to replicate by itself. It's not going to mutate. The designer has to mutate the car now to get a new design. On the other hand, here, if you create a new virus and let it out, from that point onwards, nature doesn't care whether the creator made it or you made it. It will now work on that virus. And this is the difference between a biologically engineered object and a human, and an engineering object. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Gaurav, is there another question from a student, or can I?
I think you can go ahead and ask.
Okay. So I'll ask Mr. Harpal Singh to ask his question, please. And then if there's another student, and I wanted to 1 minute interruption. We are at 1850, which is 6:50. Professor Balaraman, given the interest we have, is it okay if we extend by 5-10 minutes?
I have no problem as long as you have the patience.
No, so if you have the inclination, we have the time.
I have no problem.
All right. Okay, Arpal, over to you. Sorry.
Yeah, Vijay, with permission from you, I cannot help but make some initial comments before I ask the question. So to Professor Balram, what a tour de force. What a tour de force. And I can say that simply for the fact that I'm neither an engineer nor a student of science, and therefore have this wonderful ability not to have to defend any particular discipline, but to be awed, by what you have said in the intermix of chemistry, of biology, of engineering, of technology, of history, of culture. Goodness me, what a piece of cake to digest. But one thing is for sure, Professor, that you have certainly defined the centrality of chemistry. At least I'm walking away with that one distinct sort of appreciation that chemistry is obviously rather fundamental in many ways, and that doesn't take away from all the other sciences. My question is a somewhat sort of, if I may say, a broader one, which is to say, so do we, and are we as Homo sapiens a form of life that is actually going to challenge the very nature and future of evolution, simply for the fact that we are the kind of life form that we are? And in your view, therefore, what could be its serious implications, either on the downside or on the upside? Because obviously we are a very unique life form that is very different to all other life forms on the planet so far.
Yes, this is actually very, I think this is a subject really for debate among people who have different views. But I think human beings have impacted the planet in so many ways. They now have in their power the ability to impact it for the good and also ability to impact it for the terrible. Many of the things that have been done in science, nuclear weapons one, biological weapons another, are extraordinarily dangerous. But if these are actually used in any way, nature will have the last laugh, because it is only Homo sapiens which will damage itself. There are many, many, many forms of life which will survive both biological warfare and nuclear warfare. And the process of biological evolution will start all over again. So doomsday scenarios which people have played through, I don't think biology is in any great danger from human beings. Human beings are in very great danger from themselves.
Right. And so you're quite right in that we are the greatest danger unto ourselves, I suppose, is the message. And in sort of knowing that humility, what would you suggest that leaders of the world should do?
See, the only thing that you can never teach a leader is humility. And it is also very difficult to get leaders to actually take time off to not worry about things that they worry about 24 hours a day, but to worry about something else which might be a little bit more philosophical, which would give them a little bit of a grounding on. Occasionally, you might get an enlightened leader, but usually such leaders don't do very well in the other spheres of leadership.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you have a student question by now?
Yes. So we have with us Soumya Gupta, who's a fourth year student in biotechnology at NU. So Soumya, if you can ask your questions.
Good evening, sir. I am a BTech Biotechnology at NIT University, and it has been a pleasure listening to you all this while. So my question would be, can we use artificially designed peptides to disrupt the binding between ACE2 receptor on the host cells and the spike protein on SARS-CoV-2 virus? So, and if this has to work somehow, then how would I ensure that the half-life of these peptides is significantly high?
Yes, I think there's a huge amount of work now going on how to disrupt the ACE2 receptor spike protein interaction. It's being done now with antibodies. It's being done with designed molecules. And there is no great problem in increasing half-life of designed molecules. Chemistry has moved far. You can increase half-life with various modifications. The problem really is to deliver these disrupting agents in the right places. See, there are many things about the coronavirus which we still need. Most of the coronavirus we do is we inhale it, no? It goes into your nasal passages, into your throat and all. It doesn't go into your blood serum. See, if it went into your blood serum and there's freely floating blood, you might try and intercept. But now to get things in all these places, there are many things which, because Ashok Mishra, I can say many things that chemical engineers might like to think about. The virus as a particle of this dimension doesn't move in free solution as it does in the lab. It's actually moving in some extremely viscous medium when it gets into your lung thing. So diffusion is limited. And if there's binding, the on rate and the off rate are limited by the environment in which it is. The laboratory experiments can give you some idea. But I think the real environment of the virus is a very challenging
Gaurav, can I take the next question from
Yes, sure.
Dr. Day? His hand has been up for a very long time. His hand must be tired by now.
great advantage in virtual seminars. You don't have to put your hand.
Toy, you can unmute yourself, please. Malindu, I think you have to unmute his picture, not his video. I think he's operating from two machines.
Okay, so I must extend what Mr. Harpal Singh said. He said he was awed. I was mesmerized. He said it was a mixture of between the sciences. I was kept wondering whether it was a scientific lecture full of a series of stunning abstractions, or whether it was a piece of literature, or whether it was profound philosophy, or whether it was perhaps a screenplay for a super movie. This is my first question, and obviously you are a movie buff, Professor Balaram, so you'll get the subtext. What happened in Ure is the first question, which you left tantalizingly unanswered. My second question is a little more serious. Obviously, between the natural and the lab leakage theory of the coronavirus, it's one step away from lab leakage to talk about biowarfare and bioterrorism. And no responsible organization can make that accusation. However, if you look at the statistics in China and you note that the official deaths are 5,000 and even unofficially doesn't exceed 2 million, is that a matter of investigation to investigate whether indeed it was a deliberate act of release and biowarfare? And does that also indicate that there is some kind of possibly antidote available in that area?
No, I would say one thing. I don't believe with all the reading that I've done and listening that I've done, I don't believe it's a deliberate leak. I believe it is an accidental laboratory leak which can happen and has happened in the past. I don't believe that this is deliberate at all. but the nature of research which is being done is dangerous and leaks cannot be avoided.
Sure.
Therefore, there is whether that research should be done or not is the real question. But I'll tell you the first question. What happened was when I was looking for Dorothy Henry, I was looking through everything on the internet. I found out where she was born. I found out where she studied. And America has all these births and deaths and everything very well recorded. So I managed to eventually find that she died in Ouray, Colorado. So then I realized that she's gone from the University of Chicago to Ouray, Colorado. So I looked on Google and found Ouray was a small town. And now how do I get in? So I found a newspaper there in Ouray, Colorado. So I wrote to the editor of the newspaper. That editor said he never knew anything about this, and he directed me to a librarian. And the librarian told me she doesn't know anything about this, but there's a historical society, and would I contact them? So I contacted them, and so I was in touch, and they were searching for something. In the meantime, the people in Arizona found the photographs, and in the photographs, there was a house there in which she finally lived, in Ouray. So I got this picture and I sent it to Ouray, telling them, look, I've even got a picture of a house. They then looked at the land records and traced the house. At this point, Ouray, which is known only for, I think, cowboys and kind of stories and mining stories, was the Historical Society was quite excited. And as coincidence would have it, the president of the Ouray Historical Society happened to be a retired chemistry professor from one of the American universities. He's gone and settled there. So I then wrote him a letter saying that, look, I'm also a chemist and I was trained in this famous laboratory at Harvard. And he wrote back to me immediately saying, it's so wonderful to hear, never knew all these things that happened in Ouray. And Ouray would like to claim credit for the discovery of coronavirus. So at this point, they put me on to their newsletter. So I was very proud of it because it's my most esoteric publication ever.
But just to return, what explains the low proliferation in China? And it is indeed lower.
See, the low proliferation in China, I think part of the low proliferation is because the numbers are wrong.
Of course.
The second is that they instituted a lockdown in the whole Hubei province very, very early. But the problem was they imposed a total lockdown on Hubei. If you go and look at the map of China, Hubei is a pretty large place. It's like one of our big states. And Wuhan is one small town in the middle of this Hubei province. So they'd actually cordoned off a huge geographical area. But at the same time, Wuhan is an international airport. And there were flights going out from Wuhan to Rome because there were Italian contracts which the Chinese had. And this is how Italy was the first affected. And then it went from Rome to New York. Even to India, it came only from two places. It first came from Italian tourists who came to India, and the other was Wuhan medical students who went back to Kerala. So the virus was exported by air, not by land.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Troy. There are a question from Gaurav. Do we have any student questions left? I don't want those to be unanswered.
We can ask Amit Ladha, who's a fourth-year student from biotechnology. We can ask the question.
Good evening, sir. My name is Amit.
BTech student, fourth-year BTech student. So recently, I just had my vaccination, and I had this question pertaining to the mutability of the coronavirus. Is it possible that we foresee or detect a mutation in the virus that might help it escape the current vaccines that have been devised? And if so, which part of the virus will display the telltale signs of this scenario happening?
All telltale signs of what one would call immune escape or vaccine escape mutants will be in the spike protein sequence, because all the vaccines are primarily towards the spike protein. And this can happen and probably is happening. But one might also hope that those immune escape mutants don't necessarily become more transmissible. There will still be reservoirs of this virus left. Eventually, the disease will become endemic.
Okay.
That is, it will be with us. A cold is endemic, influenza is endemic. They're all there, and we keep getting it in cycles. This will also become, the vaccine companies are going to do very well. They're already deciding on third doses, fourth doses, boosters for next year, and so on. So this will go the same way as influenza.
Okay.
But hopefully, we will all get enough immunity now to fight it off, and then it becomes another cold.
Thank you, sir. I was actually really scared about this scenario happening, and your answer actually relieved me of some of my stress.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't worry too much about that at the moment. If we wait another 3-4 months, we will know how this is going, and I believe the peaks will come down.
Professor Balaram, thank you so much for staying back so late, but I would keep the last question for the lady, our president, Professor Parimal Manke, and if she has a very pertinent question relating to the university students itself. Yeah.
So thank you, Professor Balaram, for profound discourse. In fact, 1.5 hours is not enough. We could go on to hear you for longer. Well, as somebody who has been in the university system for a large number of years and therefore observing students and their inclinations to study what kind of programs, what I find is that the interest, at least as far as India is concerned, the interest in science and pursuing a research career in science is quite on decline. Though pursuit of science is so fascinating, but we have not been able to, espouse that degree of interest or possibly show them the career paths, whatever it is. So my question is that how do we restore really the position of science and the serious research in science, and to restore the glory of science in India? I'm talking particularly about Indian context. Everybody is out for engineering, IT, Java, .NET, this, that, so, we are lost. And whatever, today you lectured to us, has really brought so much insight into the challenging and fascinating career that science provides. And just a side comment, Dorothy's story, of course, first time I heard her name, but reminded me of Marie Curie, who also did not get a position in the university. And she had to do her research in a hard way outside the bounds of the university. So I think women Nobel laureates have time and again, and I hope Dorothy may emerge as maybe as a Nobel laureate in future, but women scientists at that level in the past have definitely suffered some kind of a gender discrimination. That is a side comment. Over to you, Professor.
Yeah. I won't comment on the gender discrimination because you've said it. That's what Dorothy Henry probably underwent in the 1960s. But as far as students are concerned, I don't blame anybody for this, because degrees are also a way to employment. And science degrees don't appear to fetch you the same kind of employment as engineering and medical degrees. One way which I've always felt was to remove the distinction between science engineering courses and convert everything into four-year courses, which is what even the new education policy now is. So India's this artificial separation of professional courses is, I think, completely, it has no basis in any academic discourse. When you label some courses as professional, you're automatically labeling other courses as unprofessional, because that's the only, and you know, children, parents, people who are not very educated, first generation learners, all of them are confused. If you add another year to your undergraduate degree, as it is in America, there's no distinction between engineering and science in America. There's no distinction between anything and anything in America. History, biology, philosophy, literature, everything. You might give students a taste of everything, and then they can choose what they want to do. If they want to go to work also, it's better. Employers now have more rounded and better informed people. Even if you want to become a bureaucrat, you've got a better education. See, there is a problem in India with education. Education is not education. For a long time, we had converted the Ministry of Education into Ministry of Human Resource Development. That means something, that you're developing resources for somebody's use. Industry often looks at education like this. What are the universities doing for industry? The purpose of universities is not to do anything for anybody. The purpose of universities is to educate students. And education must be broad. Afterwards, people do what they like. Some people will go to science, and maybe the better ones might go because they like it.
Professor Balaram, we have 13 questions unanswered and comments unanswered, and we would pass them on later to you. We don't want to intrude on your time even beyond this. So Gaurav, could we work towards the summarization now?
Vijay, could I come in just for a second?
Yeah, sure.
What Perrell said was, where Professor Balaram works now, NCBS, the director of the institute is Satyajit Mayer. He got his BTech degree from IIT Bombay in mechanical engineering, and then converted himself into a biologist, and he's heading a major biology institute in the country. So all these things can also happen. There are several other cases like that. The other, actually, that was a comment based on this. The very quick one is Professor Balaram, in my introduction, I didn't want to say that, he actually got COVID and was hospitalized. Would you like to say one or two sentences about what went through your mind when you were undergoing COVID infection?
No, I should say, in one way, I was fortunate that I got COVID in the first phase. I was one of the early people to get COVID because my wife went to work and picked it up and brought it home. Everybody was terrified of COVID at that time. And therefore, that experience was quite terrible because we were immediately packed off to hospital 10 days. We didn't get very sick, but it was a sobering experience because even when we came back, everyone was afraid of you and we were quarantined for 14 days. In the second phase, everyone's gotten used to COVID, although the second phase was more deadly. But the first phase, I used to joke at that time when I got COVID that it's the only thing which I've got in common with Amitabh Bachchan is that we both got COVID in the early stage. So later I found that we were no longer unique. Everybody got COVID after that.
That was a wonderful comment that you made. There are many more things common between you and Amitabh Bachchan. If on a separate note, we'll tell you that. Yeah, Gaurav, over to you.
Yes. So I have a better plan for you. So let me ask a student, I think, who were the main audience. So may I ask the fourth year student, Mr. Jitendra Reddy, if you can please come up and summarize Professor Balram's talk.
Sure. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for such an engaging discourse. While I'm sure there are a lot of takeaways from this particular talk, I'd like to highlight a few that caught my attention. Firstly, I'd like to take the statement made by William Osler home. William Osler said that soap and water and common sense are the best disinfectants. And I can't help wonder that in today's world, where there's a lot of information, common sense is of prime importance. Because if common sense is what we can use to make sense out of all the misinformation that's there, that's been around. So soap and water, while they protect you from the virus itself, misinformation also does a very important job in protecting you from the pandemic. And so I just wonder how William Osler made that statement 100 years ago. Second thing is the importance of women in science. I think the story of Dr. Dorothy Henry was quite inquisitive in itself, because our understanding of a pandemic today, the path for that was paved by Dr. Dorothy Henry and her colleagues back in the day when women were not even encouraged for going with such pursuits. Thirdly, I'd like to point out that the Feynman's lecture about the atomic hypothesis, I'm definitely taking this home. And this is the one point that made me feel very much empowered, because now I believe that I have the knowledge required to start a new civilization, because I understand atomic hypothesis as it is taught to me in my 8th grade. So I feel very empowered, sir, from that point. And I did realize the importance of chemistry now, after studying it for a long time. And finally, I'd like to point out that science is multidisciplinary, yet very holistic. And sir has gone through, diverged into all of the topics, including scientific advancement, biology, physics, chemistry, and even culture. And I couldn't help but wonder how interconnected all of these things are. And I'm definitely taking that point home as well. And with that said, I'd like to take a leave. Thank you so much for your talk, sir.
Thank you, Jitendra. So,
Thank you.
So I would like to offer my sincere thanks to the distinguished Professor Balram, for delivering this enriching and thought-provoking lecture. I would also like to express my appreciation to the panelists for their valuable contribution to make this Learn from Master Series lecture a grand success. I would also like to share my gratitude to Professor Ashok Mishra for agreeing to be a part of this webinar. I would like to convey my special thanks to the participants who have been extremely cooperative in staying with us, in the NU board members, the distinguished guests, NU faculties and the students for their active participation for the evening. Last but not the least, I would like to thank Mr. Vijay Thadani, Professor Parimal Madke, Professor Rajesh Khanna, Dr. Utkarsh Raj, Mr. Puneet Bajpai, Mr. Balindu Bhatnagar, Mrs. Monisha Tandon, for their support in creating a learning platform for all. Thank you, everyone.
So with this, we still did not introduce everybody who was on the panel. Professor Rajesh Khanna from IIT Delhi, he also was on this panel, and he's also the incoming president. So I thought I'll introduce you to him for a future occasion. And I do know that I have a bunch of questions. I'll connect them to Professor Balram for his comments. And my apologies to all the questions that could not be addressed. Looking forward to a continuing interaction with Professor Balram and with all of you as we go forward on the Learn from Masters journey. Thank you very much, and good night.